When we name ionic compounds, there are certain rules that we can follow. So again, to remind ourselves, an ionic compound contains ions. It contains cations, which are positive ions, and those are the metals. And it contains anions, which are negative ions, and those are the nonmetals. So looking at the rule here, it says cations right here, named the same as the metal. Okay, so going down to our example, here is a sodium, that's a metal, and so we just call it sodium ion. All right, then we look at anions, right here. So anions, it says change the end of the nonmetal name to IDE. Okay, so that's chlorine, and that's an anion. Nonmetals are anions. But instead of saying chlorine ion, I change the ending to IDE, so it becomes chloride ion. So here's two examples. And recall from our previous video on writing formulas, the metal or the cation is first, followed by the nonmetal or the anion. So here's a formula, NaCl. So we name the metal the same as the metal, sodium, and then to the second one we change the ending to IDE, chloride. So here's another example. Here is the anion, barium, so we name it the same as the metal, barium ion. The anion is from nitrogen, so we change the ending to IDE right here, and we get nitride ion. So then we have the formula right there. We name it the metal the same as the metal, barium, and then the nonmetal has the IDE ending, nitride. So we just call it barium nitride. Here's another example. So K is a metal, it's a cation. It goes first. We name metals the same as the metal's name, so potassium ion. Sulfur is a nonmetal. It forms an anion, so we change the ending to IDE, and we get the sulfide ion. So when we have the formula of the ionic compound, we just put those two things together, and we get potassium sulfide. So before we go to the next rule, let's try to do a few. So all of these have metals followed by nonmetals. You can pause it here if you'd like and try to answer them, and then I'm going to go ahead and answer them now. So pause if you want to try it first. Okay, so you're going to name the metal, so that's sodium, the same as the element, and then it's fluorine, but we're going to change the ending to IDE, so this is sodium fluoride. Get it? So the metal is magnesium, so it's magnesium, same as the element. And then oxygen, though it's the nonmetal, we change it to IDE, we get oxide. Oh, I made a mistake here when I was writing the formula. Even instructors make mistakes. Okay. All right, and so this is strontium, same as the metal. And then bromide. Lithium. So really you're just naming the two things, but remember oxide to change the ending to IDE. Aluminum, and then chloride. So the first rule simply is, if you have the ionic compounds, metals and nonmetals, you name the metal the same as the element, and then the nonmetal, you change the ending to IDE. Well, sometimes if we go back and look at our notes, sometimes there are a certain group of metals that can have more than one charge. Now in this course, I don't have you memorize them, and there is in your textbook a nice periodic table that has some pictures with these metals in them. And just to give you some examples, so you don't have to memorize these for this class, like chromium can form a 2+ and a 3+. They're almost all transition metals. Iron can form a 2+ and a 3+. And again, if you go investigate in your textbook in this chapter, you can find a list of these. Cobalt can form a 2+ and a 3+. These are all transition metals here. Now, some transition metals like zinc only forms one charge, just a 2+. So not all transition metals can form more than one charge, but oftentimes the ones that can are the transition metals. So again, go check out your textbook and look in the textbook for a periodic table that has these different transition metals with charges. Now, how we have to treat this different, we know from the previous lesson that the charges on the cations determine the formula. So we have to be able to name it. So here's the rule. When the metal can form more than one cation, positive ion, use a Roman numeral to show the charge. Okay, so this is iron with a 2+, so we name it iron with a Roman numeral 2. Iron with a 3+ is called iron with a Roman numeral 3. So this would be chromium with a 2, Roman numeral 2, because it has a 2. I don't know if I can write it here. This has chromium, probably because I spelled chromium wrong. Made it too long. Just concentrating on 2. Chromium. And then this would be a 3 because it has a 3. Whoops, sorry. Sorry. This would be a 2. It's close to the, you guys can't see it, but there's a little button that moves the pages and my pen's close. Okay, we did this one there, iron 2 and iron 3. But this would be cobalt with a Roman numeral 2. Because there's a 2, and this would be cobalt with a Roman numeral 3. And then zinc wouldn't have to have a Roman numeral because it only has 1. So then if we go down to examples down here on how this works then, so iron, since it can be a 2 and a 3, if it's an iron with a 2, we would say iron 2 chloride. So we're going to name the nonmetal the same. If it's an iron 3, we say iron 3 chloride. Now looking at the formulas, how could you tell that one was a 2 and one was a 3? Oftentimes, how many of the anions, the second one you use, tell you. So iron, if it takes 2 chloride ions, then it's a 2. If it takes 3 chloride ions, then it's a 3. So that's often a little hint. So let's go ahead and look. So here are some examples, and if you want to pause it right now, you can pause it, and and then I'm going to go give the answer. So pause it now if you want to try and see what you can do. All right, so I know this is chromium, and I have the table, my periodic table, chromium. I have it on showing me, and chromium can form a 2 and a 3. I see that there's a 3 there, so it's chromium 3, and then we'll name the nonmetal with the IDE, chloride. Now this one's a little trickier because it's 1 to 1, and so what we know with 1 to 1 is that the two charges are the same. So I know Pb is lead. I could look on the table in my textbook and see lead can be a 2+ or a 4+. And the only way to know is to know what sulfur is. So sulfur is in group 6A with oxygen. And from a previous video, we learned that group 6A forms a 2 negative. So since this is a 1 to 1 ratio, if sulfur is a 2 negative, then the lead has to be a 2 positive, because they would have to match, right? So if it's a 2 positive and a 2 negative, then they cancel. So this is lead 2 sulfide. So the takeaway there is if you have a 1 to 1 ratio, you have to look at the anion, or the second one, and figure out what its charge is, and that will tell you what the charge of the first one is. And again, that's only important on these metals that can form more than one cation. Okay, SN is 10. And I look here, it took 4 fluorides, so it would be 10 for fluoride. And then this is iron, and iron can be a 2 or a 3, but since it took 2 bromides, I know it's a 2, so it's iron 2 bromide. So that is a twist on the naming. Now I have one other thing that I put here to practice, and this is where you're given the names and you have to come up with the formulas. This really goes back to the previous video. If you have the names, you have to know the ions in order to get the formulas. So if I had calcium bromide, I would use the periodic table, which is the first video in this chapter. It's group 2A, which has a 2 plus. Bromides are in group 7A, the halogens, it has a 1 minus. And then I could figure out calcium would need 1 and bromine would need 2. So calcium bromide. Okay, now the next one, copper, there's a 1 right there. So I know it's a copper with a 1 plus. Iodide is a halogen in group 7A. Those are all 1 minus. So a 1 and a 1 cancels, and it would be Cui. Magnesium is in group 2A, which is a 2 plus. Sulfur is under oxygen in group 6A. This is a 2 minus. So they both have 2, so I just need Mg and then an S. And then chromium, it tells me there's a 2, so I know this is chromium with a 2 plus. Chloride is a halogen, so that's in group 7A. That's a 1 minus. So chromium, chloride's a 1, so it's just chromium and then Cl2. So the takeaway here is if you're given a name, you have to get the ions before you can get the formulas. This all takes practice and review, so find some practice in your homework or in some of the videos or other practice things in your textbook and do a little practicing.